Welcome to the Negotiation in Real Life podcast. I'm your host, Nicole Davidson, and in this podcast, we'll explore the art and science of negotiation in real-world situations. Whether you're negotiating a business deal, asking for a raise, or trying to resolve a conflict with a colleague or loved one, negotiation is an essential skill that can help you achieve your goals and build better relationships. Through interviews with experts, real-life stories, and practical tips and techniques, we'll deep dive into the strategies and tactics that can make you a better negotiator. From understanding your own negotiation style, to reading body language, handling difficult conversations, and overcoming common challenges, this podcast will give you the tools you need to negotiate with confidence and achieve your objectives. So whether you're a seasoned negotiator looking to refine your skills, or someone who's new to the game, join us as we explore the world of negotiation in real life. In this episode of Negotiation in Real Life, I speak with Darren Dupont, Canadian national sports broadcaster and the CEO of Dupont Media. Darren is an award-winning entrepreneur and an industry leader creating waves in the media and business world. The creator and co-host of the nationally syndicated The Rod Pedersen Show, Darren is engaging viewers and creating content to grow and expand his presence every day. What makes Darren successful is his drive and passion to grow his business and personal following in unique and forward-thinking ways, utilising technology and the advancements in media and online streaming. In our discussion today, we speak about what it means to have trust in a negotiation, open communication and vulnerability, the changes in the process of negotiation in contemporary times, how expectations play a part in negotiations, the most challenging negotiations and how to get through them, advice on when you're starting out in your negotiating career, what the best sports teams do that more businesses should do, and much, much more. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Negotiation in Real Life. Today, I'm excited to introduce to the podcast Darren Dupont, all the way from Canada. Darren, before we get into it, perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself to the listeners, tell them a little bit about who you are and what you do.
You bet. All the way over in Canada. So maybe not familiar with your entire audience. So who knows which one of our programs end up being broadcast all the way over there. I'm a broadcaster, entrepreneur here in Canada, a sports broadcaster by night and a branding entrepreneur by day. So lots of American football, hockey, of course, being in Canada on your broadcasts. And then my agency, Dupont Media, we work in the branding and media production space. So that's what I do here in Canada.
Fantastic. And I have to ask, when you talk about hockey, are you talking about the version on the ice or the field hockey?
It's the version on the ice, although we do have some field hockey over here too in our university sports scene, but nothing that's reached my plate here in terms of television broadcasts yet.
Fair enough. Well, interestingly, of course, here when we talk about hockey, we're talking about the field type because there's not so much ice around. I love it.
I bet.
So, Darren, obviously you're a very busy person and fingers in lots of pies, but as an entrepreneur, obviously there's all sorts of negotiations that go on. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit over the space of your career. Has there been one particular negotiation that's really stood out for you as a learning experience?
Oh, there's been a few, Nicole, when it comes to negotiations. I mean, you learn something every step of the way. And the biggest thing I think I've learned over the course of a number of different negotiations, whether it's in negotiating new advertising contracts in the media business, whether it's in partnership negotiations, in the business side of it, whether it's negotiations for talent or other contracts personally, I've always felt, and one of the things that I kind of go back to all the time is, and not just in contract negotiations, but just in life, is expectations versus reality. And I feel like it's really important in life to set proper expectations and even overdo it. Because I find that especially in a world where we at least are aware of so many of the mental health things that people deal with all the time, and we have such great spaces to deal with that and help people and things like that, and more awareness and openness to talk about it. One thing I find that leads to a lot of that is when reality doesn't meet the expectations we've set, right? So we set expectations in
Totally.
our relationships, we do it in the business boardroom, and I hear something that maybe isn't said because I've set expectations in my own mind that maybe weren't what you intended, right? Expectations for this call, expectations for the podcast. So I'd say right away, that's one thing I've learned right away is set proper expectations when you're going into the negotiation. And then the outcomes, at least when you present a contract or you're working on the finishing touches, everybody will be on the same page.
Yeah, and people aren't surprised. And that's one of the things, isn't it? When you get a surprise, particularly when it's a nasty surprise, that's when that fight or flight mode can kick in and we start making poor decisions and all sorts of
Yeah.
things. So I'm really fascinated, having talked about how important that is. How do you do it? How do you manage those expectations at the other side?
I think you have to have open communication. You have to have trust. You have to have a little bit of vulnerability too, because we're always, especially with our phones and the internet, like there is so much data now,
Mhm.
right? So I think everybody is so cautious about getting taken advantage of. Everybody's got an angle, right?
There's not a lot of trust in the world, is there?
You know, and you have to have trust. With no trust, I don't think you're not going to get anywhere, at least in an open relationship. I think so. You need to communicate and you need to have vulnerability. I don't think there's enough vulnerability, whether it's in the personal or corporate world. Vulnerability to put yourself out there and say, look, this is what I want. And the other person might not be on the same page. And guess what? If they're not, then it's probably not a negotiation you want to be a part of, or it's not a relationship you want to be a part of. Some people like to use the get to know fast, like try and get to the decision, like get to knows, right? And you don't like to talk about failure, but sometimes it's good to just find out rather than tiptoeing around it for months and still getting to the same destination.
If you're going to get to a no, you might as well not waste time getting there. I think that's right,
Yeah,
isn't it? And I guess there's a certain amount that you have to go through to do that exploration, to understand where people are coming from. Is there a good fit between the two parties before you can get to a no? So I guess you can get to know quicker with someone that you know and have a relationship with already than somebody that you're
for
just
sure.
getting to meet.
Yeah, absolutely. You can. You can get there really fast again, but being open, being vulnerable. And I believe in, you hear this all the time where you've got to earn my trust. You've got to earn my trust. And
Mm.
I kind of go the opposite, and it sets you up to potentially get hurt at times. But I think that's important too, is you got to come to the table with trust. You have my trust 100% until you break it. And
Yeah.
I feel like it's important to come to the table open and with trust. And that's the only way you're going to be able to move forward, I think, and create anything meaningful.
Yeah, well, have you had examples? I mean, I think that's a really interesting approach to bring to negotiation. Have you had examples where that's backfired on you?
It has, for sure. And we talked about some of the examples that might come up in this call. And the one I go back to is in the media business. One of our flagship programs over here is the sports talk show and here in Canada. And when we were negotiating to try and build the show, it wasn't something where I was building a show and I'm going to negotiate for the best talent I can find. The show was built for the talent specifically, the one
Yeah.
person in mind. It was their show, and it still is. And we still do have an incredibly close relationship. We are very open. There is a ton of trust. But because of the situation, leaving one job, entering into a space of what's going to be the next step in their career, the trust is kind of, it's there, but it's almost questioned at times, right? What's the angle? And
Mm.
so for full transparency, I mean, he was looking at what the next move was going to be, and it was going to be potentially, there was a few offers on the table. And what would make my offer the best? He came from a traditional media place, radio, television, right? And based on non-competes, he couldn't go back to that space. So what we were offering was a digital show.
Yeah.
And you have to think about the world we're in, and you're looking at somebody who grew up in a linear traditional space, digital media, Facebook Live, YouTube, right? It doesn't necessarily scream credibility, right? It screams new age, young kid in the basement, all those types of stigmas and stereotypes. So, do you want to come and do a Facebook Live show when you've been on this huge radio television platform for 30 years? And so, through the process, there was a lot of instances where I would ask him questions about what other places were offering because we
Mm-hmm.
had that relationship, right? I'd like
Yep.
to know what's on the table. So if I need to reach a certain salary, if I need to create expectations, I want to know that I'm creating what you need. I'm meeting those expectations, right? And I think there was some sense at the time where I don't know if trust was questioned, but I think he questioned a little, why do you want to see the offer from somebody else? Why do you want to see that? Right? I don't know if I can trust you. And it was just because of a recent pattern of his experiences
Mm.
that he was now cautious of everybody. Had nothing to do with anything that had happened between him and I, but those expectations, right, were being questioned, right? Why do you want to see this? What's the purpose, right? And can I trust you moving forward? And it created a lot of difficulties in the negotiation when we had that sit down at a table over a coffee and those words, I don't know if I can trust you, and I'm not going to show you that information. And that was really a roadblock.
Well, it's interesting because at least then you know what the roadblock is, don't you? Because you go, okay, now I know the problem here is I've got to find a way to get you to trust.
Yeah.
And whether that's, I think what's interesting about the example you've just talked about is it's very much looking at what we talk about in negotiation speak as his BATNA or his best alternative to negotiating with you. What are these other options? And the way you've described it is that you're saying to him, I need to understand this so that I'm putting my best offer and I'm getting a fair chance against these other options. It's not so I can lowball you or I can do anything else. Although, of course,
Right.
the fear from his side would be, hey, you might have been going to offer me more than what they're giving, but because I tell you, you're going to offer me less. This is the trade-off, isn't it? It's like, how much do you give that information? And this idea of trust is really fascinating because I always say to people, it's a beautiful thing to have trust and to want to give people that benefit of the doubt. But at the same time, there's a certain need to query things. So it's almost about how do I be trusting, but also cautious and conservative so that I don't just trust blindly, but I'm asking the questions in a soft way to back up what they're saying.
If you don't have some sort of process to fact check and be cautious, you end up being my 75-year-old dad who takes the call from the random telemarketer and signs up for this service, and all of a sudden his credit card is stolen and there's $30,000 of charges on there. For sure. You talk about trust, and you need to have that vulnerability to give people trust, even when you've been hurt in the past. But you're right. Like, it can't be just blind without actually having some checks and balances in there and some processes for making sure that you're not being taken advantage of.
Do you ever feel stuck in a negotiation or conflict? You're not quite sure what the next step should be? Friends and colleagues may give advice, but perhaps they're only seeing things from your side. My new negotiation GP service is for exactly that situation. You can book a short, standard or long consultation where we will explore your situation using a systematic approach. You will walk away with concrete steps to follow and an increased confidence to manage the situation. To learn more, head to my website at nicoledavidsonnegotiation.com.au where you can book a consultation online. Don't forget, I also offer one-on-one coaching, team training and expert advice on specific negotiations. My tailored approach is designed to meet your specific needs, and my proven methodologies and strategies are grounded in the latest research and best practices. So whether you're a small business owner, a corporate executive, or anyone in between, let me help you achieve your negotiation goals and maximize your success. Yeah. So obviously as an entrepreneur, you've talked about the fact that you're doing lots of different types of negotiations. What are the negotiations that you find the hardest or the most challenging?
I think the ones that are the most challenging is when there's a lack of a relationship. I feel like sometimes it's when you're meeting somebody for the first time, that can be a good thing or a bad thing. But when there's no familiarity with who you are, what your product is, and not an obvious need or path to success here, I feel like those are tough. When you're doing a lot of convincing, when you're trying to introduce yourself for the first time, but you're also working in terms of deadlines and trying to push deals through fast
Yeah.
because they take a certain amount of time. You need to introduce yourself. You need to build some trust. You need to create awareness of who you are and what you're offering, find out what the client's needs are or the person on the other side of the negotiation, and then be able to put the best offer in front of them. Sometimes that's the most difficult, is having the patience to go through that, right? When it's somebody brand new. And how can you draw the lines to, we've just met, but now we've got, here's the angle and here's why we can have this personal connection really fast.
Yeah, and that speed is a real thing these days, isn't it, too? Because we are all in a hurry wanting to get things done. And
Yeah.
I remember from my own experience, my family moved to the Middle East about years ago. And my husband is a mergers and acquisitions lawyer. And when we first got there, it was really frustrating because he'd come back and say, I've had 3 meetings with the client and we haven't even talked business yet, because the culture there is very much about building that trust and relationship before you get started. And yet in Western culture, we don't do that so much. And it's that chicken and egg thing, isn't it? Do you spend the time building the relationship to make the negotiation smoother, or do you just get in there and get it done? So I think, like with everything, it's a bit of a balancing act, isn't it?
When you can't measure the ROI of those interactions, right? It's hard to know what value I'm driving specifically from spending an hour with you on a Zoom call or going for dinner with you and potentially paying for that dinner. And
Yep.
Everybody wants to know, well, what's the return on that investment? Well, I might not know for 10 months, right? But you need to plant several seeds all at the same time. And some of those aren't going to grow. And you're going to have wasted your time and you're going to have spent money and effort and they're just not going to grow. But others are. And unless you plant a lot of seeds and continue to work at it, it's the only way to know and have real success, right?
Absolutely. And I think what even flows from that is when you look at, obviously in a smaller organization, you've got a lot of flexibility about how you do things. But when you then touch upon larger organizations who have really detailed procurement processes, which are almost designed to minimize the ability to develop personal relationships and let them influence buying decisions, it's a whole different game.
It really is. It's a massive different game, but we have to look at and learn from some of the best companies in the world. And you see companies like Google who have strict R&D departments where employees are given a certain number of hours every week to just play with ideas that are in their head, where most of them will never work, but they know that one of those ideas that somebody comes up with in those 2 hours a week is going to be the next billion-dollar product that Google rolls out to its consumer base. And it will make up for all the time spent on all the things that don't work out. So you do need to play the numbers game a little bit. You have to have confidence in the process and in yourself. And that can be difficult to do when you have a manager breathing down your neck, being like, what did you do today? How many sales did you make today? What's happening today? Well, I played golf and I went for coffee and I was on the... Why? Building relationships. You have to trust the process. And when you have somebody breathing down your neck, micromanaging you, it can be really difficult to trust your process and trust your gut.
For sure. For sure. So I'm really interested, Darren. Obviously, you've developed your career, you've grown a successful business, and you've had lots of lessons in building your negotiation skills along the way. If you were talking to someone perhaps more at the beginning of their career who hasn't had these opportunities, based on your experience, what would you recommend to them to develop their negotiation skills at an early stage in their career?
Well, it really depends on the negotiation skill. There was one really great branding example on the negotiating side for sales that has stuck with me. I've never done it, but the process was, and again, I'd love to be able to credit whose idea this was. And I did listen to it in a podcast and I apologize that I can't, but it stands out that he took the new employee to a coffee shop and 10 days in a row. And every day he had to go and ask for a discount on his coffee. Okay. He had to ask for a discount. He couldn't tell him it was a work project. He couldn't say it was an assignment. It had to be a really authentic process of trying to get a discount on his coffee. The coffee is the price of coffee. It's the $1.90 or it's $2 or whatever it costs. and you needed to get a discount. And just that process of just being able to ask is
Yeah.
so difficult for people, right? We deal with it when we're teenagers, asking a guy or a girl to dance or to buy a drink or to go out on a date, or, right? We're always dealing with the fear of just stepping up to the plate. So I
Yeah.
feel like that's the first thing, is going through that process.
I love that. That is so great. Yeah. It's like, how many negotiations do we lose because we never actually start them because we talk ourselves out of it? Fabulous advice.
So many. And I think about when I was younger. I'm 36 now, so I'm talking about being 19 and going out to the bar and the club and that type of thing. And you're so nervous. But when you ask the girl to dance and she says yes, and you dance, it it becomes easier to ask the second girl to dance.
Yeah.
And the third one, you build the confidence of, and when you get a no, that can be difficult. So you go back out, and it's really difficult to do. So I think that's really important, stepping up to the plate, having as many conversations with new people as possible. And if that's difficult for you, then find out how to break those barriers down. So maybe you need to go to networking events with somebody and learn how you can lean on your network to make introductions. And the more people you can meet, now you're comfortable meeting new people, right? And you can kind of go through that process. I think the only way to get better at it is to practice. And the only way to practice is to get reps.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think that the thing that I'd add to that, the thing that I always add to that, is it's not just about the practice, but it's about taking the time to reflect after you've practiced, because repetitive practice without reflection just embed what you might not be doing as well as you could. And I always say there's two questions to ask after every interaction is, what did I do well in that interaction? Why did it work? And what could I have done differently that I should do differently next time? And if you do that, those
Huge.
two short questions after every interaction, obviously not everyone because we're busy, but the important ones, they are the two questions that will have you continually developing your skills.
I'm happy you said that, because that's something that I've been thinking about and trying to figure out how to bring that into my business and into my day-to-day more often. And it's from
Yeah.
the sports world. You know,
Yeah.
it's the practice of watching game film. The best sports teams in the world watch game film. They sit down and they study the film and they say, why did we win? Why did we lose? What did we do well? How can we be better? And I
Yep.
don't think we do that enough in the business world.
I think you're absolutely right. And it's fascinating because even back in my day when I was practicing law, practicing insolvency, we'd often talk about getting to the end of a transaction and doing a review of it, but we were always too busy to do it. So it never really happened. And I think you're right. You do look at professional athletes, and that's what they're doing all the time. I do some of the coaching work that I do with people. We actually get them. It's very hard to record a live negotiation, but often we'll do role plays and we'll replay it back to them, and they get to actually see what they've said in the moment. How did they respond to that question? And it's quite enlightening because our memory of the occasion afterward is very
Yes.
different to the reality.
Big time. I notice that all
Yeah.
the time when I'm doing games and broadcasting different hockey, football games on television. You don't always spend time going back and watching it over. And so when you go back and you watch it over, I'll say, did I really say that? Did I really say that in that moment? Really wish I would have done this. And then I learned from it. And it
Yeah.
wasn't something that I did for the first decade of my career. It's only something I've been doing recently. But as a result, I've noticed a great improvement in the job that I'm doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sometimes people will be doing that in one aspect of their career or business, but they're not doing it with others. So once again, I guess you get what you focus on, don't you? So if you want to be better at negotiating and having those challenging conversations, you've got to focus on it to improve.
For
Same as
sure.
you would with delivering sales or doing your broadcast. So really interesting. Well, I've had a really interesting time chatting to you. I certainly love having entrepreneurs on who've gone through this journey, because I think one of the interesting challenges is learning to negotiate is something that happens by chance so much. And it's really interesting hearing people's stories because it is an essential skill to being successful. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing those.
I appreciate you having me.
I do have listeners in Canada. but I'm sure there's other things. So if people were interested in connecting with you and learning more about what you're doing or some of the broadcasts, how can they reach out to you?
Yeah, I mean, social media is always the easiest way to find me. It's at Darren Dupont. That's my handles across all platforms. So literally drop into my DMs if you've got any questions or anybody wants to chat. That's where they can find me. I mean, you can go to my website, darrendupont.com as well. But again, drop me a DM. I'd love to hear from the audience.
Fantastic. And we'll put all those details in the show notes for all the listeners as well. So once again, thanks very much for coming on the show, Darren.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
That's all for this episode of the Negotiation in Real Life podcast. I hope you enjoyed our discussion and learned something new that you can apply in your own negotiations. Remember, negotiation is a skill that can be developed and refined over time, so keep practicing and pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find us on social media or email us directly. And if you liked this episode, please leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It helps us to reach more people and continue to produce high-quality content. Until next time, keep negotiating in real life.